We had an hour's warning when it happened. None of our satellites could detect it until it was too late. Governments told their citizens to seek shelter wherever they could, but shelter be damned for what we were facing. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget when or where I was when it hit. I was in the middle of giving my high school graduation speech when the police came to deliver the announcement to take cover. The chief of police rushed on stage, took the microphone from my hands and told us that we had less than an hour to secure our loved ones and get to shelter before the meteors hit. There was only a moment's hesitation after the mic went silent that we all began to move. Mothers and fathers began picking up their children as fast as they could, crying out to the nearest neighbor for help if they had more kids than they had the arms or strength for. Adults eventually began grabbing the children nearest to them, whether or not they were theirs, and took off towards the school. Meanwhile, my fellow graduates and I wasted no time bolting down the field into the school. I remember only pausing long enough to get a vice grip on Johnny, my best friend, the salutatorian to my valedictorian, before taking off. I remember the feeling of adrenaline flooding my system as we ripped down the field. We came close to stumbling as we avoided the onslaught of people rushing past us, but we never stopped until we were well into the gym. Half of my attention was on Johnny, who was doubled over gasping for air, and the rest was focused on scanning the growing crowd for my family. They found me before I could find them. My family as a whole is very doting, so between my parents, siblings, and I, there was a lot of fussing to make sure everyone's okay. It takes a few minutes, but we're all eventually satisfied in knowing that no one's hurt. Rattled, yes, but completely unharmed otherwise. Ah, my heart, I'm sorry your big moment was ruined, Mom frowned sympathetically. She turns to Johnny, whose family arrived when mine did, and reaches out to her to give her a hug. And I'm sorry your moment was ruined, too, sweetie. I know how hard you two worked for this. Johnny cracked a smile, obviously still a bit frazzled. Well, you know how I feel about public speaking, Auntie A. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. I gave my best friend of many years a dry look before popping her on the arm. Yes, because the imminent threat of being crushed or drowned to death is such a blessing. The only blessings of today were those scholarships we got. Yes. And waking up. Please don't give me that look, Mom. A sneaky grin curled across Johnny's lips. Oh? I could have sworn that an hour ago you said seeing Antoine decked out in his suit was the biggest blessing God could give you today. You're acting like you weren't drooling over Devon so hard that you could have filled an entire cistern. And so the banter began. The two of us quipped back and forth, mercilessly teasing each other about everything and anything. Our families talked quietly among themselves, leaving us be. It's a commonly known fact that Johnny and I use humor to cope with stress, and then more than ever, we needed to laugh until we couldn't think anymore. Our efforts to distract ourselves only lasted so long. It was a little while longer before the gym doors were sealed, the windows were boarded up, and the principal delivered a short but sweet speech about what her students mean to her and how proud she is of us. A police officer followed that with an announcement that the impact is only minutes away. The only sounds heard after that were muttered prayers and I love yous. I don't think it possible for me to forget the moment when the meteors hit. The first one was a ways away and could only be heard, the second was closer and caused the ground to tremor, the third shook the building. I felt the fourth ripple through my entire body. Ceiling tiles shook loose, bringing traces of dirt with it, and there were loud cracks heard from all over the building. Johnny and I were curled up back to back, facing away from each other and towards our families, but still touching. I could feel her shoulders quiver in fear. I wonder, still, if she felt mine do the same. I remember listening to my dad praying for our safety, how it felt to have my fingers tightly laced through my older sister Anagata's, the other hand clenched tightly by my brother Thomas, and most definitely recall exactly when I felt a change in Johnny. Her body hunched over suddenly in a rack of frighteningly harsh coughs. It wasn't long before Johnny keeled over and began convulsing. Thomas, a practicing EMT, acted faster than any of us and rushed to her aid. I watched in horror as my best friend seized on the floor. Her body moved as if something inside of her was desperately shaking at her ribs as if it was stuck in a cage and was demanding to be let free. Johnny was the first, but she most certainly wasn't the last. People by the dozens took on her symptoms within minutes. Screams were constantly bouncing off of the walls in haunting echoes. Looking back, the most frightening thing about those traumatizing moments was that the choking, spluttering cries weren't from those hurting, they were from those of us who were unaffected. The sick didn't have enough air in their lungs to scream. By the time the police came to give us the all clear, the entire outdoors was a chartreuse color. The air, the ground, the rooftops, the playgrounds, the beach shore, were all covered in the powder that was such a distinct, sickly shade of green. We were handed flimsy paper masks to filter out the visibly tainted air and told to stay indoors. We tried to rush Johnny to the hospital, but it was already overrun with people by the time we got there, so her family took her home. For the next few weeks, we stayed parked in our houses and only left to get food. After a while there wasn't much of a point in doing that either, seeing that the stores have already been picked clean already, so most of our mornings were spent fishing. Thankfully, the toxins from the meteors had little to no effect on our marine life, so many of us were able to survive off of our fishing lines. Those who were unable to go out to the reefs, banks, or the north and south drops to cast received what the more successful fishers could spare. As sad as it is to say, our island's sense of communal care and compassion could only do so much to alleviate each other's suffering. The elderly and infirm began to grow ill quickly because of the lack of medicine and humanitarian aid that the states would usually provide during these times. The only contact we had received from the mainland was via the live streams the government had been filming to keep the country updated, but other than that, it seemed to be every state or in our case territory for itself since no one area was well enough to help its own people, more or less those from another region. NASA didn't need to announce that the meteors are made of some sort of toxic, powdery material, anyone with eyes or lungs knew that. The substance stayed in the air for so long that even after several weeks, it barely showed signs of clearing out. It caused people across the world to drop like flies. Hundreds of thousands died, some, like Johnny, fell into a coma and the rest of us were lucky enough to get away with feeling weaker than ever, but still very much so grateful to be alive. It was when the air began to dissipate into a light minty color that they arrived. Unlike the life-wrecking meteors, our satellites and governments saw them coming. The large ship kept its distance, parking itself in our orbit. It stayed there silently for a week. No matter how many messages we sent out on every frequency we could think of, the ship kept eerily quiet. Citizens across the globe were outraged by the UNS who, for the first time in history, was actually all nations peacefully united for a single cause: lack of military response until they announced that, if they were to send out any large-scale weapon to combat the ship, it would set off a catastrophic chain reaction. The powder is extremely reactive when exposed to high temperatures, so it was likely that any action on our part would have demolished a large section of our already weak atmosphere. And so we sat, waiting for the worst, praying for the best. At the end of the first week, they sent a shuttle of their representatives down to the UN's headquarters in New York and parked right on their front lawn. The live stream was cut before viewers could get to see what they look like. 2 hours later, the UN gathered the press to release a statement. The interstellar beings possess technology centuries ahead of our own, some of which is capable of fixing the damage done to our planet and people. The government told us that their help came with a cost, as all things do, but the price was to be announced later once the trade treaty was properly ratified. No one at the time really cared what their help would cost us, all that mattered is that we now had a chance at survival. The next morning, there were these drones swarming the skies worldwide. The UN told us that the at the time unnamed aliens, had all returned to their ship and sent down probes that were collecting data before starting treatment, so we humans ignored them for the few days as they zoomed about scanning the land and its inhabitants. On the 7th day of the treaty being drafted, they came back down to Earth again, but this time they didn't leave alone. It all happened so fast, the rapping on my door, these large, mask-clad figures wordlessly handing my parents an official government subpoena for me with a print off of an official letter from the President of the UN. I had less than 30 minutes to gather a few trinkets and say goodbye to my family. There was a rush to squeeze in all my goodbyes and pack my favorite things into a single backpack. The letter I was given said that where I was to go would cover my necessities, clothing included, so I grabbed only my electronics, a few books, and some things that would remind me of my family. In my haste, I still managed to record a video for Johnny telling her where I'd be if and when she woke up. Well, I told her where I thought I'd be. The letter said that I, along with many of my peers from around the globe, was being chosen to go to their ship and remain there in orbit as a part of a cultural exchange. Our assignment was to help teach the newcomers about Earth, its art, history, languages, entertainment, and culture from the perspective of its use. As an anthropology major, I jumped at the chance. Despite my going not being an actual choice of mine, a subpoena isn't synonymous for optional invite for a reason. Now, as I am hurtling through space at speeds I thought impossible, my excitement has long since left me. I'm far from where my expectations placed me and even further from home.